The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, folks. Dr. Charlie Hall here from Texas A&M University. Glad to have you online this morning. We've got a great webinar topic ahead of us today. It's one that's going to be riveting and very timely. But before we get there, one of the first things I want to do is I want to say a quick shout out, give a quick shout out to all our sponsors. And you can see them on the screen here. We've got three different sponsors. Let me start with the middle one, AmericanHort. And of course, AmericanHort, as you well know, is our common association that was a consolidation of ANLA and OFA. And Craig Regelbrugge, who's our speaker today, of course, is with AmericanHort. So thank you very much, guys, for that support. And then also a quick shout out to the Southern Risk Management Education Center, who has sponsored our webinar series for the past few years. And so that continued funding is a great kickstart for our series each year to make sure we can continue those. And then last but certainly not least, our Texas Nursery and Landscape Association has been a longtime supporter of this webinar series. So a quick shout out to them and thank you to them. All right, little housekeeping details. If we see the webinar attendee view, your desktop may look a little bit different depending on what your screen saver or your desktop picture looks like. But you've got this control panel over here on the left. And so what that control panel allows you to do is to change the dynamics of your webinar experience. So if you don't like what you see, you can change it. And so a couple of little quick things. That little orange box there basically allows you to open and close this control panel and get it out of the way. So you just click on it like that and get that sucker out of the way. If your window is a little small, you can make it full screen just by clicking on view there and going full screen. You can change the audio mode. If you're having difficulty with your own microphone and speakers, you can switch to using the telephone. And if you do that, it'll give you the number to dial in. That's not the number. I'm just using an example number there. So it'll give you a unique number and a unique code and audio pin for you to plug in. And just click that in. And of course, today, webinars are always unidirectional, right? We're speaking at you. But you do have an opportunity to ask questions. And there's a questions box as part of your control panel. And that's where you're going to be asking your questions. And with today's topic, I'm sure we're going to get plenty of questions. So be sure and pop in those questions there. And then at the very end, right, I'll remind you of this when we get there, but there is an evaluation, and it's 7 quick questions. It'll take you approximately 28 seconds to complete, right? So but those 28 seconds are very precious to me, and I know your time is valuable. And so if you can provide feedback, it helps give us, some inside thinking on what you're thinking about what's important and what's not. So be sure and complete that evaluation, and it helps our sponsors really to help justify their sponsorship. So thank you for that ahead of time. Now, if you happen to be called off the webinar for any particular reason, no worries, because we're recording this webinar. So you'll be able to view this on your own time as many times as you want. And the ratings on our webinar series are always very high. So a lot of people review these things after the fact. So you will be getting an email with a link that'll go back to the Ellison Chair website where I have my webinar series, and you'll be able to click on that link and then also view the recording of today's webinar. So that brings me to the topic at hand. I am delighted and tickled to introduce a friend of mine and a great representative of our green industry, Craig Regelbrugge, who's Senior Vice President for Industry Advocacy and Research for AmericanHort. And Craig has been doing this for multiple decades and has, of course, many contacts and an established network in Washington. He works on the behalf of all of us in the green industry. And as you well know, there are a sundry of topics and issues that are hitting us like a 2x4 across the head right now. So he represents us on our behalf. So on behalf of all the folks online today, Craig, let me say thank you for that. And then I'm also going to reach up here and I want to give you the presenter rights so you can go right into the presentation. So, Craig, welcome today and thank you for being here. And we look forward to your comments.
Fantastic, Charlie. And everybody who knows Charlie knows he is a great friend of the industry and a great personal friend. So thanks for everything you do. All right, folks, we have, I'm going to try to move very, very quickly through some of the really top issues that are going on in Washington and try to leave time. So be thinking about if you've got questions or things you want to ask about or share at the end. We're going to try to make sure we leave plenty of time to do that. Greetings from your nation's capital, where it is hot, a high of about 90 degrees, and we have a code orange air quality alert underway. And so the first thing coming from Washington is a lot of hot, bad air. Other than that,
that's pretty funny.
Here we go. Yeah, so other than that, wanted just to remind everybody, AmericanHort is a whopping 2.5 years old, but the organization is built on the strong foundations of 220 years of legacy of the two organizations that came together to launch AmericanHort. And our members, we are the big tent for the industry, representing the industry nationally, including everything from breeders and growers of all types through interior and exterior landscape and garden retail, the last folks who are touching our wonderful products before they're in the hands of the final consumer. This is our highly photogenic, at least in my skewed opinion, team that is leading industry advocacy and research. Most of us are based here in DC, the exception being Jennifer Gray on the far right, who is our research programs administrator, and Jennifer works out of our headquarters office up in Columbus, Ohio. So for today, we're going to move fast, but we're going to talk a little bit about these issues: pollinator health, overtime, a little bit about labor and immigration and the outlook there, the latest on plant certification, and just a few other goodies before I'm going to tiptoe around the most delicate topic of the day, which is the presidential race and the November elections that are looming. Okay, pollinators are a great place to start because if you didn't know it, it is Pollinator Week. Usually about the third week in June each year is an organized week where folks are trying to bring a lot of attention to the plight of pollinators, but also the kinds of actions that every one of us can take to help to sustain healthy pollinator populations so that they can sustain us. And obviously, whether we like it or not, as an industry over the last couple of years, we have found ourselves very much in the center of the pollinator debate. Sometimes that's been bad news and negative news, and certainly right at the heart of this issue has been the controversy swirling around the use of certain pesticides in the industry, particularly systemic insecticides, and most particularly the neonicotinoid insecticides. Famous Baltimorean H.L. Mencken once said that for every complex problem, there is an answer that is clear, simple, and wrong. And in the case of the pollinator health issues, anybody who is pointing to one causal agent, one factor, one problem, is doing exactly this. They're taking a complex problem and they're presenting an answer which is clear, simple, and wrong, or at least incomplete. The experts know the following, that in terms of honeybee and other pollinator health challenges, we've got a lot of things at work. Some of the bigger ones are parasites and the diseases that they vector, genetic and physiological weakness, lack of good quality habitat and forage, and certainly we cannot deny that pesticides are a factor, but they're only one factor of a number of them that are at work. The threats we face as an industry in this space, normally we're focusing on federal legislation. In this particular case, there really isn't much prospect for Congress actually passing anything dealing with pollinators. Frankly, they're having trouble passing much of anything at all. And so pollinator legislation, either good or bad, not seeing a whole lot of activity out of Congress. We are watching the federal regulatory picture very closely. As you might know, EPA has a series of risk assessments underway looking at the neonics initially. It's worth noting that the first the first phase of this work, which looked at imidacloprid and a variety of mostly food crops, the news that came out of that assessment was actually mostly positive, with sort of a higher than expected level that you had to reach with respect to residues before you saw negative pollinator impacts. But those processes are underway. And it's very, very important to us that EPA keeps its eye on the science and follows the science. But it's also worth noting, if you're thinking this is just about neonics, there are 76 active ingredients that are in the queue for EPA to be looking at additional data with respect to potential pollinator impacts. So just about every insecticide that's being used in the industry, and as well as a few herbicides and fungicides as well, are being looked at very closely. But we're very worried about threats we face at the state and local level and in the marketplace. State and local meaning municipalities or even states who might take the problem into their own hands and might move well-intended but poorly conceived measures forward in this space without waiting for a little bit of a clearer science picture. And then there's the question of the marketplace. And obviously, a lot of the sort of activist groups have been targeting mass retail to try to force changes in the marketplace that they haven't been able to successfully force at EPA or in Congress or other places. For us, it's not about defending any one particular class of insecticides. It's about knowing that we've got an array of tools in the toolkit to meet our responsibilities to effectively manage pests. And so we're really concerned that good science shapes the toolkit and that the toolkit has every tool that we need in it. For this reason, about 2 years ago, we launched what we call the Horticulture and Pollinator Stewardship Initiative, which has become known as Grow Wise, Be Smart. And this is the collaborative industry initiative where we're trying to move forward a couple of different goals. I'm not going to go into great detail today, but just to hit the highest of the highlights, for us, the goals include 3. Number 1, to fund, leverage, and guide research to give us answers to key questions that we frankly need more information on. Number 2, we want to contribute to the efforts on the part of growers and landscape managers to practice good stewardship. And so we're open-minded to the fact that some practices might need to change as we go forward, but we need to step up to our commitment to provide for healthy habitats and good stewardship for pollinators. And then the third, and this has been a really exciting area that we're very actively involved in, is to partner with other groups that share an interest in the key problem of habitat and forage, and they want to work together to improve bee and other pollinator habitat and forage. On the research side, we have directly funded several $100,000 worth of research, and we've played a role in guiding several hundred additional $1,000 and soon several $1 million in federal investments in research to help provide answers that we need as an industry. So that's an area I'm not going to go into more detail today, but for those of you who are coming up to Cultivate in Ohio in a couple of weeks, Cultivate 16 will be featuring a lot of progress reports and updates on what's been going on there.
In fact, Craig, that was one of the questions that just popped up a few seconds before you said that, and the question was, are there any sessions at Cultivate that are going to be discussing this topic? So,
yeah, absolutely.
Also, is there a particular day that you remember those occurring?
You know, if you go to cultivate16.org, you can take a look at the full educational session, the full schedule for sessions. But they start on Saturday, which my feeble memory, I think it's the 9th, and they continue on through Tuesday. And there's education every day. The education comes in 2 formats. Some of them are classroom formats, which tend to be longer treatment of topics and a little more detail. And then we also have an area called Live for Growers, which is in the main concourse of the trade show, where there are sort of much briefer presentations. In fact, Charlie, I think you did one. You were channeling your best Bridget Behe last year, as I recall.
Yeah.
And so we'll have content there. And yeah, we're going to be doing a lot talking about the pollinator issues and the latest updates. In fact, Dan Potter, from University of Kentucky, who is one of the researchers we have funded, is going to be talking a lot about work that he and a grad student of his have done looking at pollinator attractiveness of a lot of the plants that we grow. And in fact, the interesting thing about pollinator attractiveness, a lot of times folks are thinking, well, this is about flowering annuals and about perennials. But the deeper we get into this issue, the more we are coming to understand that woody plants are actually a huge piece of the puzzle in terms of providing nectar and pollen. And in fact, they often do so at critical times of year, like in the relatively early spring, when other plants are not yet in bloom. And so Dan Potter has been doing work to help quantify, what are the things that we can be planting in the woody realm. And Pollinator Week, I already mentioned, it's Pollinator Week. The theme for this year's Pollinator Week is trees for bees, and so it goes to that point about the incredibly important role that woody plants, including some flowering trees, are playing for pollinators.
Yeah, so diverse landscapes are an important part of this pollinator challenge.
Yep, and we need to be stepping up to the challenge as an industry to be designing and installing and providing the plants that create, instead of just pretty landscapes. Charlie, it goes to what you're always talking about, which is it's not about pretty. Pretty's nice, but it's about the economic, environmental, and human health and well-being benefits that our industry's products and services provide. And this is a piece of that.
Yeah, great point. Okay, thanks. That's a good answer to that question.
Good. So I'm going to end with a call out to, or shout out to Greenscape Gardens, a very active and influential member of ours in the St. Louis area. And Greenscape Gardens has really been the poster child nationally for embracing this issue at retail. And it's not just about butterflies, but it's partly about butterflies. It's not just about natives, but there are a lot of useful native plants that maybe we've been overlooking as an industry. And these things, many of these plants are very, very important for the role they play sustaining pollinators. So this is the opportunity side of this whole equation. So I'm going to move on to the next issue I want to touch on, and we'll have time to loop back on questions on pollinator or other issues. And Charlie, per usual, feel welcome to step on in when you see something popping across in the chat box.
Okay.
So overtime, lots of news about overtime. The Labor Department at the federal level has recently announced changes. These changes are particular to what we know as the white-collar exemption from overtime pay. This is the broad-based exemption that a lot of administrative and clerical and other types of staff have fallen under, where they are salaried rather than being paid on an hourly basis and subject to overtime. Well, what the Labor Department has done is to dramatically increase, basically to double, the minimum salary that an employee will have to be paid in order to possibly fall under this exemption from overtime going forward. This will take effect December 1st, and that salary threshold, that minimum salary threshold, will be set at $47,476 per year. There is a provision where a portion of that, up to 10%, can be paid through bonus or commission arrangements, but with sort of strict rules around how those are structured. As I say, this is basically a doubling of that minimum salary threshold, and the Labor Department is going to implement a process by which that number automatically increases, with notice provided in what's called the Federal Register every 3 years. The greatest impact we're expecting in the industry will be at retail, in some of our landscape operations, in the greater supply chain, and frankly in the associations themselves. Because as a practical matter, in many parts of the country, that's $47,476 per year is a pretty high salary threshold. I want to point out a couple of things that are slightly better news, and that is, first of all, no change to the duties test. There are a series of tests that, if the salary threshold is met, then you have to consider the job duties, and so the Labor Department did not change the duties test. Outside sales staff are unaffected because they live under a separate set of rules with respect to salary. Most importantly, for folks who have their feet planted firmly in growing, the agricultural exemption from overtime pay is unaffected by this change. And so we have a lot of compliance challenges in our industry with the ag exemption from overtime. People who are purely engaged in growing, that's their business, they're fine, but you start to get into into trouble areas when a company is growing, but they're also buying in plant material from others that they're merely reselling. Or, for example, if somebody's a retail grower, but they're buying other kinds of products, plants and tools and fertilizers and stuff that they're selling at retail, that retail operation would fall outside of the agricultural exemption. So we do have some compliance challenges, but the ag exemption is in effect. There are some bills pending that would bring about a delay by requiring the Labor Department to sort of more seriously consider the economic impact of these changes. And but I think given the nature of things in Congress, the possibility of these bills moving prior to December 1 is quite low. And so businesses, I think, need to begin the process of assessing how are they going to live with this change in the rules, how are they going to adjust their management practices, and so forth. So this is a major issue that we're going to be watching going forward.
Hey, Craig.
Okay, want to switch?
We had
Yep,
another
go ahead.
person. Can you? The question was, can you clarify real quickly the duties test?
I don't have the duties tests locked in my head, but the duties tests sort of relate to the degree of autonomy, whether there is supervisory responsibility with the position, whether the position has some autonomy with respect to structuring what it's doing every day. But the duties tests would be spelled out certainly on the Labor Department's website. So more details can be found there, or I'm happy to follow up.
Okay.
I don't have them at my fingertips. There are, I believe, like 8 or 10 different tests that can be applied.
Yeah.
But
so
again,
they're listed on the. I'm sorry. So they are listed on the DOL website.
Yeah, they would be listed on the Wage and Hour Division of the DOL's website. So if you go into dol.gov and look for Wage and Hour Division, they would be listed there.
Perfect.
But then also, bear in mind that the salary threshold is the litmus test. So if somebody is below that salary threshold, the duties, you can't even go to looking at the duties test. The salary threshold is the first hurdle you have to cross.
Gotcha.
Okay, so a little bit on workforce and immigration. This has been a very difficult journey, obviously, for this industry, made worse given the sort of the tenor around our political debates of the day. Want to kind of build out what's the issue. I mean, first of all, much of our industry is engaged in growing their agriculture, and in the agricultural setting, we have about 2 million workers that are hired each year to perform agricultural labor and services. A lot of those workers, of course, are seasonal. The best available information from government-sponsored surveys would suggest that more than half of that workforce does not actually have proper work authorization. They lack proper immigration status. They have most likely shown the employer papers which appear genuine on their face. The employer generally is doing what they need to do, but the rest of the story is if the documents were held up to close inspection, these people might be found to be unauthorized. It's a huge chunk of our labor force and a huge chunk of the talent pool that sustains horticulture. We have a temporary visa program known as H-2A that serves the agricultural sector. Growth in the program is very rapid. It is a difficult and expensive program to use, but it does give the peace of mind that somebody's got a legal workforce. And so we obviously are paying close attention to trying to protect and preserve a functional H-2A until we can get into a broader reform environment. In the downstream economy, so beyond the growers, I think, Charlie, this is from your work, there's somewhere on the order of 960,000 folks who are engaged in landscape-related labor. The percent unauthorized in this sector is less clear. We don't have the same precision in the data sources, but I would guess that it would easily reach 20 or 25%, at least in the labor-related classifications. We of course have, again, a temporary program that many in the landscape sector turn to. It's called H-2B. It has a cap on the number of visas that can come, that number of workers that can come in each year at 66,000. And even in the landscape sector, where landscape is the single biggest user of all industries that use H-2B, landscape is the single largest user of the program. but yet the program still represents less than 5% of the workforce. It's an important 5%, but it's a little less than 5%. I mean, so there's no doubt when you sort of understand the structural challenges and the worsening labor shortage situation, there's no question that we need broad-based modernization of our immigration system so that we can have a 21st century system with a 21st century economy. But obviously, at least for the near term, there's really not a path forward. And part of the reason for that is, remember Schoolhouse Rock, when we were marched through the process of how a bill becomes law. Well, Schoolhouse Rock has gotten a little muddled, and the bill is having a little trouble finding its way on Capitol Hill, and so just not much is moving. Now, as a result of demographic changes, and Charlie can wax eloquently about this stuff, but we're seeing major demographic shifts, including the aging and increasingly retiring of the baby boom bubble of population. And so the Congressional Budget Office fairly recently came out with a report which said we are going to be looking at slow long-term growth in the U.S., somewhere on the order of 2% averaged out, driven largely by the aging of our labor force and the demographic shifts that are underway. Now, if we wanted to have sort of a more comfortable rate of growth, which I think, Charlie would be the last word, but 3 to 4% feels a little more comfortable than 2%, we have a couple of options to consider. And one of those is we could convince baby boomers to continue working beyond their death. And if that doesn't work, then we can look at immigration policy. And I'm talking both about permanent legal immigration as well as temporary programs. The societies that are struggling with this issue the most are the societies that have the most rapid demographic shifts, and in some cases fairly closed societies like Japan. The U.S. has been much more open to immigration in the past, and if we retain that kind of openness with appropriate security checks and whatnot, then we will be economically stronger and for the better. In the meantime, till we can get to a more serious conversation in Congress about immigration reform, this is sort of what we're up to. Number one, we are defending the programs we have. And politically, sometimes this is a debate where who you thought was your friend is actually your enemy, and who you thought was your enemy is actually your friend. 2 weeks ago, there was a hearing in the Senate presided over by the Republican majority, Jeff Sessions from Alabama being the chairman of the subcommittee where this hearing happened. And the Republican selected witnesses were basically slamming the H-2B program. And they consisted of a construction trades union boss, a leading voice of an anti-immigrant organization, a spokesperson from an organized labor-oriented think tank, and a worker advocate. And so these were the Republican witnesses. You would expect Republicans to perhaps be the more pro-business party. In this case, it was exactly the opposite. Meanwhile, the Democrats, thanks to the ranking Democrat on the subcommittee, Chuck Schumer from New York, the Democrats gave us the opening to have a free market economist take a pro-employer view, and that was Dr. Steve Bronars, who used to head up the school, the economics department at the University of Texas at Austin. And so sometimes in this debate, the world is upside down, but we were defending ourselves there. On a more positive note, we just got a letter signed by 102 members of both parties in the House of Representatives, basically putting pressure on the agencies that are responsible for processing these visas to do better than they did this past spring, to streamline their processes and to make it work. I will mention that tomorrow we have a vote, we expect to have a vote in the House Appropriations Committee. They're going to be considering the spending bill that funds the Department of Homeland Security, and we're expecting a vote on the H-2B exemption from the cap for certain returning workers. So we're expecting that vote tomorrow. We're expecting a close vote, very important vote. And so those of you who have members in the House who are on the Appropriations Committee, if they haven't heard from you yet, there's no time like the present. And if you go to AmericanHort.org and click on advocacy, and click on voter voice, you can go right to the site where you can do that. Don't want to go into detail on this, but wanted to mention that we are hours or days away from the Supreme Court issuing its decision on some of the executive actions that President Obama took back at the end of 2014. And they will shape the playing field to the near term if they're allowed to go forward. If not, it's pretty much status quo. There are some folks out there who are popping good ideas into the mix. Senator Flake from Arizona has proposed legislation that would create a year-round pilot program for temporary workers as opposed to the seasonal programs we've got now, but it won't be going anywhere, and so obviously we're all looking to beyond November. Shifting over, wanted just to super high level mention that there's a lot going on in this whole space of plant certification for pest and disease and quarantine compliance for either interstate domestic movement or international movement. And the thing I wanted just to briefly mention now is that we've got a domestic pilot program underway. This pilot program is known as Systems Approach to Nursery Certification, or SANC. Not my idea of a great acronym. Sounds ominous, but but it's a good thing all in all. What this is all about is basically it's a change in mindset from a certification system that has largely relied on looking at plants at the end of the production process and inspecting them for pests to a more integrated prevention-oriented approach. This is similar to the kinds of programs that are widely applied in the food industry now that we know as HACCP. Or Hazard Analysis Critical Control Point. And basically in HACCP, you're looking at the food, you're looking at what are all the things that can go wrong in terms of biological, chemical, and physical hazards through the production process, and you're taking certain steps, whether it's sanitation or a diagnostic test or whatever the case may be. You're sort of building the expectation of pathogen-free product into every step of the production process rather than trying to catch it at the end. And that's really what's going on in the nursery context. So for operations that are taking a look at this SANC program, it's really kind of a 5-step. The most important step is right up front. It's doing a facility risk assessment, which identifies, what are the hazards and where can things go wrong. This involves looking at, what are you using for growing media? If you're a container grower, where does your water come from and what are hazards associated with that? Are you buying in new plant material? What safeguards are you taking to make sure you're not bringing pest or pathogen problems in on new material, and so forth? So the risk assessment is really the foundation. From that, you develop a manual which contains a pest management plan and sort of documents your procedures. That manual ultimately gets reviewed and approved. Then you're into implementation of management practices that I say are designed to prevent these problems from occurring or to catch them early, record keeping and training, and then all of this is overseen by the mostly state regulators that we work with. So this whole program is a 3-way partnership right now, which involves industry through AmericanHort and our Horticultural Research Institute. It involves the feds, USDA, and it involves the states through the National Plant Board. There are 8 pilot operations in it currently. These are the 8, and there are 2 per plant board region. So we've got Conrad Powell Star Roses and Plants up in the Northeast, along with Lucas Greenhouses in New Jersey, Southeastern Growers in Georgia, Forest Keeling right there in the heartland outside of St. Louis, Missouri, Greenleaf in Tahlequah, Oklahoma, and then 2 McKay up in Wisconsin. And in fact, Tom Beekle at McKay is going to be leading a webinar that we're doing this afternoon. That's going to be, it's a part of a series that's explaining this whole process to people who want to learn more about it. And then out west, we've got Walla Walla Nursery, which straddles the border between Washington and Oregon Pride in the Willamette Valley. And this pilot is, go ahead.
No, someone just popped up a question about what time is the webinar and how to get to it.
Yep, the webinar is at 3 o'clock this afternoon, and you can go to AmericanHort.org for more details on it, and it should be advertised there. If not, pop me an email. I showed it up front, but I'm Craig R. at AmericanHort.org, and we can get that to you. And these are all going to be recorded as well. So, just like just like the conversation we're having now. If you can't take the whole thing in, you can always go back. Same here. And so more information both at AmericanHort.org and also at the National Plant Board's website.
Perfect.
Okay. I want to just flip over, because so many folks are so frustrated with Washington and this perception that nothing good is coming from, or nothing is coming from Washington. And I do have to be honest with you, we are not spending as much time on Capitol Hill as we might be if Congress were working in a more functional manner to solve some of the problems that the nation faces. But where we are working is we're collaborating a lot with the regulatory agencies, sometimes playing defense, but sometimes playing offense. And a lot of that offense is about being in the solutions business. It's about trying to find the resources to drive solutions, through research and development to some of the major problems that we face. We have a research endowment ourselves, and that research endowment funds, we have about $11 million in that endowment that funds, usually several $100,000 worth of research each year, and also scholarships. We also have a very robust partnership with USDA's Agricultural Research Service, known as FNRI, and FNRI invests a little over $6 million in research in our industry each year. And then the Farm Bill is becoming increasingly important. So we're spending a lot of time working to shape the Farm Bill programs that serve the specialty crop community, including nursery and floriculture. And so some of the funding coming through the Farm Bill has helped us put first dollars toward boxwood blight, toward solving our challenges with sudden oak death or Phytophthora ramorum, with downy mildew, with the pollinator challenges, and also with other technologies like this so-called intelligent spray technology, where a consortium of USDA ARS and university researchers have developed an amazing piece of equipment, which there are prototypes in roughly a half dozen nurseries in Ohio, Tennessee, and Oregon. And this is laser guided, and there's a Doppler radar feature to it and all this. And basically what this machine will do is move down a row of plant material, and it senses where there's canopy, where there's plant structure to treat. And these specialized nozzles are opening and closing, they're emitting and they're closing, so that you're only applying a pesticide exactly where it's needed, and you're not spraying it on the ground, and you're not spraying it where it's missing the crop. This work is ongoing, and the latest or the newest phase of the work, which has begun, is looking to take the slick technology behind this machine and be able to retrofit existing spray technology, potentially in a nursery or even in a greenhouse operation, so that you can have the benefits. And the benefits are huge in terms of reduction in active ingredient. You can pretty much cut active ingredient applied in about half with this new technology, and those are savings that ultimately then fall to the bottom line. Okay, now comes the tricky part, and then we're going to see if there are any additional questions from the group. And I need to say, when I get down to the last bullet here, the presidential race, this is the world according to Craig. I'm not going to be speaking necessarily official positions from American Hort as much as just some reflections myself. But before we get there, let's bear in mind that we do have a congressional election as well. In the Senate, 1/3 of the 100 seats are up for grabs. And the Senate is very evenly divided right now, with the Republican majority holding 54 of those 100 seats. The toss-up states you can see here, all but one of those toss-up states are states that are currently held by Republicans. So, I mean, aside from the Donald Trump factor, the rest of the story is that Republicans are defending a lot more real estate this year, and so I think the odds are pretty decent that the Democrats will. I mean, I think it's a sure thing that the Democrats are going to narrow the margin, but they may well take control of the Senate. In either case, it's going to end up being very close to evenly divided, just a seat or two either side of the 50-50 line. In the House, probably less excitement over there unless something really unexpected happens. There are 435 seats in the House. 247 of those are held by Republicans. That's a pretty comfortable majority. While there are 45 open seats, the reality is that most of these are Republican seats, and most of them are safe. There are really only a small handful, or I guess technically 3 handfuls, of seats that are truly up for grabs or could be potential toss-ups. So at least from where we're sitting today, the Republicans are likely to hold on to the House of Representatives. So then we have the presidential election, and I'm being a little bit irreverent here, forgive me. But who ever thought that this is where we would end up in this particular race? And it certainly gives us a lot to ponder and a lot to think about. I can tell you, I've talked to plenty of folks on the Republican side of the aisle who, where their head's at right now is, there's no way I can vote for Mrs. Clinton, but there's no way I can vote for Donald Trump. So I'm just going to go and I'm going to vote for everything else on the ballot, and then I'm just going to kind of conveniently skip that block. I don't know how broadly that'll actually happen when election day comes. But it's quite interesting. I mean, here we have both presumptive nominees with very high unfavorables, both with lots of concerns over character, or in the case of Mrs. Clinton, trustworthiness. In the case of Donald Trump, I think you might even call it stability or predictability. And yet, obviously, these candidates offer a stark contrast between the two. It's interesting to note. I read some new data that were out, at ODark 30 this morning, and while both of these candidates have very high net negative favorability ratings, 2-to-1 American voters polled say that Clinton is better prepared to do the job. Her challenge, of course, is particularly pronounced among less educated, aging white folks, mainly men. Whereas Trump, as of this morning, has an 88% unfavorable rating among African American and Hispanic voters. 88% unfavorable. That's pretty stark, and I think particularly, Hispanic voters are a fast-growing voting bloc, and it's going to be interesting to see, how they leverage their increasing voting power at the ballot box. So I guess it gives us a lot to think about with both of these candidates with respect to their electability and what I'm calling their governability, or their ability to get the job done and to run the show. I suppose in the interest of the nation, whoever it ends up being, if indeed the presumptive nominees go forward, all I can say is I hope, if it's Donald Trump, that he absolutely surrounds himself with a bunch of people who know how to run the show, who know how the system works, because woe are we otherwise. I think we'll be lurching from crisis to crisis. In the case of Mrs. Clinton, she's obviously very deeply experienced and considerably more policy oriented. I think the concern there is, does she govern from the middle? How much is she pulled to the left, given the fight that she's had with Bernie Sanders, and a desire to try to consolidate some of his support? And does she govern from the middle? Is she a centrist voter, a centrist president rather? And I would certainly hope that is the case. So, here we are. We are at the proverbial fork in the middle of the road, or fork in the road, and whichever fork we take, there is one thing that you can rest assured, and that is that either candidate will have your back. But I want to just sort of end on a more serious note by saying that from our perspective, this is all about the long view. In our business, credibility and integrity mean everything. And a good reputation takes 20 years to build, and it can be destroyed in 20 minutes. Secondly, we choose our battles. It is about advancing the industry. It's about positioning the industry to succeed in the future. We are very comfortable seeking common ground, and sometimes that means figuring out with our adversaries, who may hold a very different worldview, is there, on what can we agree. It's about policy, not politics. We do not exist as an organization, or frankly, the industry doesn't exist to advance the fortunes of one political party or the other, but just to make sure that they understand what it takes for our businesses to succeed. And as I said earlier, we fundamentally believe that as we move forward on this hot increasingly crowded planet, our plants and the services that we provide are part of the solution to so much of what ails us. Final point, opting out ain't an option. Our founding fathers, like it or not, created a political system which is inherently competitive. And if you opt out, you can pretty much be assured that the interests that have a very different worldview are going to gain the upper hand. And so opting out, as frustrated as people can get, opting out's not an option. And you look around the world, as frustrating as we can find our system, it's really not, unless you're into a benevolent dictatorship or a friendly monarchy, it's hard to get much better than our system. So the note I will end on is one of optimism, and I draw that optimism from our good friend Winston Churchill. And the reason for that optimism, Winston Churchill said at least once, probably often, the Americans will always do the right thing once they have exhausted the other possibilities. So for that reason alone, I am optimistic. Charlie, let's see if we've got any questions on these or other issues. Charlie, did we lose you?
I was muted and I was talking up a storm and I was waxing on eloquently. Now let's see if I can repeat that. There are a couple of questions that, and one I might just weigh in on myself is basically, I'm paraphrasing the questions, under which immigration scenarios would cause the greatest economic growth? I'm paraphrasing the question, but because it's a rather long question, but let me just chime in there. The Congressional Budget Office has done several analyses on this particular topic, and I can basically cut it down to this nugget, that the only scenario in which the economy grew positively over the next 20 years, it was with comprehensive immigration reform, and that a protectionistic type of policy caused a negative in the as far as economic growth. So we had not necessarily a recession, but we had basically zero or less than zero growth over the next 20 years if we had such a policy. So then the other question here, Craig, is basically given both of the candidates the fork in the road, what are the potential? Is there a prognosis? I think that's the word that they use. Yeah, prognosis of how would the immigration picture sort itself out under each one of those scenarios?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to address that question, and I'm going to start with Mr. Trump, and I have to tell you, in my professional opinion, Mr. Trump has done this nation no favors with the demagoguery that we have seen so far in his campaign around immigrants and immigration. We obviously, I think, would probably all agree we need a well-secured and well-managed borders. The idea that we need to build a wall across the entire border with Mexico, I think, is frankly anathema to our values. And our illegal immigration problem with Mexico is dwindling, largely due to demographic shifts that are occurring and economic shifts that are occurring in that country. So I think if we blew $20 billion building a wall, we'd look back a few years later and wondering what were we thinking? Were we smoking medicinal marijuana or something? But that all said, I mean, I think that Trump has been so far out there on the issue and has surrounded himself with very hardline advisors, starting with Senator Jeff Sessions of Alabama and some of his staff, that I don't know how you put that back in the box and take a fresh start. And so I think the little bit of an opening that we might have with a Trump presidency, at least when things settle out, would be to try to advance our goals of protecting and preserving the existing programs we have. It's worth noting that whether he knows it or not, he probably does by now, in Donald Trump's own business empire, he owns a vineyard which is using the H-2A program, and he owns, his Mar-a-Lago compound in Florida is a fairly significant H-2B program user. So again, know it or not, he's got some skin in the game. On the other side, in the case of Clinton, Senator Clinton, or I'm sorry, Secretary Clinton is very policy oriented, and she understands this issue very well. I will say that when she ran for Senate in New York the first time, she had a good base of support in the urban areas, particularly New York City, but she was generally vilified out in the countryside, in the rural and agricultural areas. She was seen as a carpetbagger, and they did not support her by and large. When she ran for re-election, a lot of agricultural interests in rural and western New York actively supported her, and this was because as a senator she had been very attentive to their needs, and so she really earned their respect over time and ultimately earned their support. I think, on the national stage, I don't know if that plays out exactly the same way. My personal hope would be that she understands this is a problem that needs to be solved from the middle. In her own sort of coalition of interests, the union movement, organized labor, tends to be very anti-immigrant, with a few notable exceptions, and so I would hope that she doesn't get sort of pulled down into the quagmire by some of the traditional Democratic constituencies like organized labor. And finally, I think the challenge that we're going to face in either event is, is Congress willing to play? And depending on how the election narrative shapes out, I think that's going to help to determine whether we'll have a Congress that wants to get this issue in the rearview mirror versus being totally unwilling to play. It's going to be interesting, that's for sure.
Great. Well, my friend, that's all the questions. We answered them through the webinar, and then also those remaining questions. So once again, great job in covering just a vast amount of material in this short amount of time. So thanks for your insights on that. I would remind folks that today's webinar has been recorded, and I'm going to pop over to the internet real quick so I can show you on the Ellison Chair website. There's under the multimedia section, and there's a webinars button, and I'm clicking on that right now, and it takes you to basically this page, and you'll see there's a placeholder here, everything you need to know about what's happening in Washington. And as soon as I get that recording live, I'll put that link right there, and you can go to that particular link and go ahead and watch the recording as many times as you need to, or feel free to pass it on. Now, the final thing I need to remind you of is of course, the very quick evaluation. Be sure to when I close the webinar, there's going to be a pop-up there, and it'll say, would you fill out the evaluation? And please do so. Again, it'll take you probably 30 seconds to do that, but it's very meaningful for us. So thank you, folks, for attending today. And thank you, Craig, for a very illuminating webinar. And look forward to seeing how this unfolds in the future.
Thank you very much, and everyone have a good day. Make it a success.
All right. Take care, folks.